Sometimes videos have to be made before the idea is fully formed. A conversation is going on online, things are said, thoughts are partially formed. But you know for whatever reason that you haven't come to the end of the idea. For whatever reason, it's incomplete. This week, I got into an argument on the internet and lost. It was an argument broadly concerning the left wing and the effectiveness of quote-unquote red-pilling people, or red-pilling people that we might ordinarily consider to be too far on the opposite side. This has been a controversy on the distant right for quite a number of years, but for whatever reason, it gained new prominence in my own mind when I returned to watching a strange leftist podcast called El Chapo Trap House. Now, for those on the right who might not know what El Chapo Trap House is, this is an incredibly popular radical left-wing podcast. It features a set of self-styled comedians, usually switching between irreverent humor and calls for radical action and socialism. Given their largely white and male fan base, El Chapo tries to steer away from the woke intersectionality language, even though they do embrace it in principle, and instead present themselves as an alternative formation of the left, an irreverent alternative to the mainstream that simultaneously preserves the humor, while at the same time maintaining the purity of the ideologically leftist and socialist principles. These are the hardcore Bernie bros. This is the so-called dirtbag left. But in the wake of the suspension of the Bernie Sanders campaign, which more than anything else characterized the practical ambition of this side of the left and those who listen to El Chapo Trap House, people began forwarding me clips from some of the authors on El Chapo, in particular clips from one Matt Christman, a person who at first glance seems to conform to all of the most basic stereotypes of the left-wing white male urbanite. Lanky, bearded, grimacing, speaking in platitudes, and almost constantly smoking pot. At first glance, Matt Christman might seem like the stereotype of everything the distant right dislikes about modern urban living. Or, for that matter, modern far leftist thought. Yet, I kept having people send me YouTube clips of this man's blog. The first clip, strangely enough, I think was meant to be included in some kind of right-wing cringe compilation, starts with Matt Christman lamenting the evils of moderate-right New York Times writer Ross Douthat, wishing he could murder or at least massively humiliate all of the trad Catholics, despite the fact that he probably doesn't know any personally, and then going on to a heartfelt speech about how much he desires equality. How much he genuinely wants the good of all people in this world, and how tragic it's denied to everyone. In isolation, the clip would seem to vindicate every right-wing stereotype about the far left, every cliché about bio-Leninism, brutality and vindictiveness hidden behind a facade of empathy that never seems really very genuine at all. It all seems vague and platitudinous and ethereal, of no more substance than anyone has when they're smoking pot. But, for whatever reason, I started watching further. This initial clip, as deplorable as it was apparently the beginning of a much larger project by Christman, and one that I did not fully understand to begin with. Parting from the usual, highly produced, jokes and interview-based podcast format used by El Chapo, Matt Christman had taken to YouTube, embracing the YouTube confessional format in its most primitive state, simply turning the camera on and confessing to his audience what his deepest thoughts were at the time. This wasn't left-wing propaganda. This wasn't a left-wing advertisement. It was a cope. It was Matt Christman's attempt to try to comfort his audience in the wake of political defeat, to give them something else, to find something more spiritual and more real in the ashes of the Bernie Sanders campaign. Of course, it would take you a while to figure even that basic information out. Matt Christman, not the most organized of thinkers on a good day, conducted and continues to conduct these vlogs in an ad hoc fashion, almost always under the influence of some drug or another. Yet, despite it all, there was honesty in these communications, and Matt Christman, despite his other flaws, was genuinely trying to develop an idea that could help his audience. This idea, on most days at least, he calls the grill pill, which of course is a takeoff on that 30-year-old boomer meme. The guy who's too concerned about grilling to really get into internet politics. He just wants to live his life, to find meaning in the small, mundane things, like having a grill on a Sunday afternoon with friends. I mean, if you're sharing good food and good company, the dour realities of the world outside seem to be less wounding, and we can find, if nothing else, perhaps psychological health. Of course, all of this is constantly couched in Marxist notions of the dialectic and of an increased class consciousness. But nevertheless, the idea coming from Christman kind of surprised me. Among the set of outspoken and highly ideological Chapo guys who did the podcast, he was by far the most ideologically set, the one most focused on leftist ideological purity, and subsequently the one who seemed like he had the least going for him outside of a possible left-wing victory and revolution. I remember Kreisman's initial attack, for instance, on Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, calling it a distraction to genuine political solutions, and following up that young men should really not pay attention to all this mumbo-jumbo about meaning, and should instead focus and dedicate their lives to a real political cause that could bring real change to real people. After all, discovering meaning in cleaning one's room was just bourgeoisie, upper-class, moralistic garbage. A diversion of the dialectic away from what's materially real and what is politically achievable. Now, in 2020, Matt Kreisman was making a 180-degree turn. Something was changing. Of course, I know that I'll be accused of reading too much into this rambly vlog, which doubles back on itself and contradicts itself many times. But listening to Kreisman ramble, I thought that I was genuinely seeing something. If not the development of his own ideology, at least the person he was talking to. The urban millennial, underperforming, perhaps left behind by the economy, and turning to leftist politics. And now, in the wake of the failure of these politics, needing something real, needing something substantive and meaningful to latch onto. This was the audience of El Chapo Trap House. It was the audience of Matt Kreisman, and for whatever his flaws were, he was trying to give them something real. He was trying to give them some consolation, something that they could base their lives around. And so, as funny and slightly incoherent as the ramblings were, I left the series with a certain amount of sympathy for the audience. Regardless of their aggressive exterior appearance, there were people who were actually asking questions on the left, who needed answers deeper than those that the left had to give. And for the better half of a month, this idea consumed my political thinking. Certainly, there had to be a way to reach these people. There had to be a way to find peace. After all, the dissident right needed new blood. It needed new people, especially those in urban areas, who had ambitions, who wanted to make art, who were and are unsatisfied with the status quo. And what better place to look than those leftism had failed? But of course, I think I probably picked the wrong month to have this particular set of speculations. The distant right, as it is wont to do, had become embroiled in controversy over the issue of hot takes. Suddenly, it seemed, everything that was once considered verboten and not right-wing was on the table, just as long as it was against the mainstream neoconservative establishment. Hey, maybe Islam is the way forward. Maybe communism is the right way to go, just to own the progressives. Hey guys, did I tell you about those base transgender lesbian catgirls? Well, at least they're not your grilling boomer dad, after all. He voted for George W. Bush. These new hot takes continued on and on down the same avenues. Everything was up for grabs. Any coalition was possible, as long as that coalition excluded the mainstream Republicans, excluded the old, boring, normie conservatives. After all, what are principles when we can write a new hot take article that gets shared 100 times about the coming neo-pagan and Islamic Caliphate alliance against liberalism? And so, among all the hustle and bustle, my own renewed interest to explore commonalities between the left and the right fell upon harsh and infertile ground. Not that there weren't entirely legitimate points to be made against a left-right alliance. After all, the left does consider the right, and the distant right in particular, to be enemy number one. Those urban progressives thirsting for meeting in El Chapo land would probably more likely fight us in the streets than listen to a pitch from someone they considered to be right-wing or bigoted. These were the people that absorbed the most of the progressive indoctrination, and they spread the most virulent and hateful progressive memes. My friend, the YouTuber Endeavor, made a video response outlining all of these points, and indeed, it was well taken. For a moment, it did seem like wishful thinking. Perhaps my desire to see some kind of radical left and right alliance was just a result of my own emotional hang-ups. And to a certain degree, I'll admit to this. Growing up in a progressive town, inside a progressive state, I have for a very long time wanted nothing more than the ability to convert people who were near me, to see a new political order where young people would be right-wing, where a barista or an artist would turn out to have radical ideas, and not simply the radical ideas that all of the old progressives from the 1960s would readily agree with. It is, such a tempting dream in my mind that I found the prospect and the ambition to explore a left-wing, right-wing alliance this time to be very, very hard to discard. Wouldn't the ordinary white urban progressive just need a nudge? Just need to find the correct right-wing opinion, the correct right-wing blogger or formulation? It seemed so close. They were asking all of the right questions. But of course, it's always more complicated than that. Halfway into planning a strategy video about how to convert left-wingers to the distant right cause, I was finally shaken out of my delusion by watching a live stream and subsequently talking to the YouTuber The Franklin. The Franklin echoed Endeavor's skepticism about possibly converting leftists to a distant right cause. After all, Dave, he said, the left would never interface with a right-wing organization unless ideological concessions were made, unless symbolic concessions were made. And you know as well as I do Robert Conquest's 3 laws. Moderation and careless ideological synthesis will almost always result in the movement towards the left. And the alternative to organizational cross-pollinization? Well, I guess that's just old-fashioned red-pilling, trying to make people see the light by feeding them the right argument. But how often does that work? I mean, speaking as the distributist, I know I've made videos arguing against the power of direct argument to convince anyone. One example that helped illustrate this for me was given by the Franklin in his livestream, a scenario I know all too well of a well-to-do, progressive, woke, intersectional parent raising a straight, white, male teenager. You know the family well. You know that the parents have every good intention for their child. Yet, as you listen to them bash whiteness and toxic masculinity, all you're wondering is, this is going to resolve to the detriment of your child. He's a straight white male, and he's going to get the raw end of this deal once these ideas about whiteness and maleness being evil become much more prominent than they are right now. For a moment, it's tempting to think of their child becoming a right-winger, and in another moment, it's tempting to believe that even you might be able to red-pill the youth, red-pill him and convert him away from his parents' misguided beliefs about his own culpability in whiteness and maleness. Yes, it's tempting, but ultimately futile. As the Franklin is very good to point out, no such attempted conversion would ever work. Unless you're a teacher or some other parental authority over a youth, you will have mere minutes or seconds to try to convert them, and that's weighed against the full force of their educational establishment and also probably their parents. Those don't sound like good odds to me. And after all, isn't it a little bit gauche to try to convert youths away from the ideology of their family, even if that ideology is entirely poisonous? Reality, it seems, would be a much, much more effective way to red-pill someone in that position. The world is changing. Old ways are falling away before our very eyes. And if all of the upheaval we see before us isn't enough to shake someone out of the ideas they've been taught, then probably very little we say will be able to do anything. And this is certainly true and wise, and it even dovetails very nicely with the analysis of Robert Conquest's first and second law, the observation that we are all conservative about the things that we know and love, and also the observation that institutions become more progressive over time, naturally. When I heard the Franklins' take on the matter, I couldn't help but think back to a reformulation of these ideas. Perhaps it could be said that as humans, we become more reactionary as we interact in dialectic with reality, and become more progressive when we interact dialectically with institutions and the narratives those institutions create around themselves. In this sense, I imagined a corollary to Robert Conquest's 3 laws. Perhaps one could call it the Franklin's Corollary. That corollary stating that it is impossible, at least superficially, to move anyone to the right through the use of arguments and propaganda, and that the only real rightward movements ideologically people make come from real interactions with power systems and their subsequent analysis. Perhaps a little bit overly simplistic, perhaps much too fatalistic, but I think that there is a core of truth here. Going back to the Franklins' own story about the straight white male son of progressive woke parents, we might ask ourselves, what is actually going to convert him to the right wing? A few choice arguments he hears from people much older than him at a party? Or is it simply the interaction with the rest of the world? The interaction with the power systems his own parents helped informing, creating, and empowering? To paraphrase the Franklin, when this boy grows older, he is going to have the reality of the new institutions hitting him in the face, and the gravity of his parents' words about whiteness ringing in his ears. If that isn't the formula for a red pill, I'm not sure what is. Reality and failure are indeed the greatest of all right-wing teachers. Still, I'm not sure that I can really leave things here. I know that a lot of people in hearing these ruminations will find only a counsel of despair, a reason not to do right-wing activism, a reason not to talk to people, a reason perhaps to not even read or develop right-wing theory about politics or about human behavior. But, as I see things now, this would be an entirely misguided conclusion to draw from the video. Politics, real politics, is more than just one-upmanship. It's more than just conversion tricks. It's a guide to how our world works, how we can collectively organize for survival. And that is a much deeper endeavor than simply red-pilling tricks. But even at a deeper level, I don't think Franklin's observations have entirely defeated my dream to one day reach or possibly even convert these lost urban progressive millennial men. It's just shown a harder road ahead. This week, in addition to thinking about politics, about possible left versus right conversations, I also had the opportunity to discuss briefly with friends right-wing themes within literature, right-wing ideas found within media generally. Looking back at great works of literature, great movies, great poetry, and great music, one can be surprised to find the most right-wing ideas, the most right-wing concepts, lying in plain view, there for anyone to see. Strangely enough, these right-wing concepts appear even inside great works that were developed, created by professed progressives, dedicated liberals and antinomians of their age. And yet, through it all, by doing their art and craft, they have exposed something deeper and more right-leaning than they even understood or knew. The preeminent example of this is a book that's quite prominent in many a right-winger's mind, the 19th century Leo Tolstoy novel, War and Peace. Now, for those familiar with the general themes of War and Peace, as well as the professed political affiliations and politics and leanings of Leo Tolstoy himself, they will no doubt understand that War and Peace was meant very directly to be a refutation of the reactionary or Carlylean notion of history being driven by great men and great events. Moreover, Tolstoy himself in his personal politics had radical egalitarian politics. And while analogy to contemporary ideas is always difficult, it's hard to not see the man as a progressive in his own age. Yet, when we read War and Peace, at least when we read War and Peace independent from Tolstoy's own self-commentary, we find an entirely different reality. Tolstoy is such a masterful realist, is such a masterful drawer of characters, that he is able to create figures that stick in one's mind, that feel real because they're based on real observations. The characters of Andrei, Natasha, and Pierre are fully realized. They're multidimensional, and they seem to live independently of the author's own views. Thus, through their own realism, through their own reflection of reality, these characters teach us lessons that go well beyond what the author may have intended. Certainly, Tolstoy had an agenda about the portrayal of the heroic in history. Nevertheless, when we read about these characters today, we cannot help be struck by their heroism, even inside perhaps a deterministic Tolstoyan universe. A reactionary, realist lesson is taught. And so, even in spite of itself, over time, through its contact with reality, art can become more reactionary. The author can build better than he intended. The entropic nature of the universe may always slouch to the left, but the nature of truth, goodness, and beauty will always point to the right. And in this fact, I see some hope for us poor souls still thoroughly involved in the modern culture war. Of course, us in the right-wing ideas community should still develop political theory. We still should discuss strategy. We still should form ideas about community organization. Politics is survival. Politics is real and it needs to be dealt with. We also should continue to reach out to the left. There, of course, is no harm in being nice to people, and part of the political game is to let the adversary know that the door is always open to them. Conversion is an option. But being the political realists we all should be, we should be aware that the conversion option, directly, is something that will very rarely occur. However, if we take what we might term the Tolstoy effect seriously, there is a much deeper conversion possibility available to the right wing, and it begins with Matt Kreisman's grill pill. There is a reason that the barbecuing boomer has always been, on the left at least, a stereotype of a right-winger. The grill and the griller exist outside an ideological bubble. They exist outside ideological discourse. The grill and the burgers are real, and therefore the grill and the burgers are right-wing, and always a threat to the leftist unity and leftist ideology. The great irony of Matt Kreisman's grill pill is that it embraces the very reality, the very real community focus that will naturally be the undoing of his own progressive online vision. I doubt Kreisman fully realizes the process, but the grill pill has the possibility of setting off a nasty chain reaction. Behind the grill there is connections to other things, to gardening, to community, to art that wasn't developed in the last 25 years. It doesn't itself ask questions about meaning, but it opens a door to a world where questions about real meaning and real identity are imminent. Who am I? What community do I belong to? What are my community's real-world interests? And ultimately, what does it mean? These questions become alarming, and they can no longer be waved away as false consciousness that will ultimately be answered by one final socialist revolution. In short, the grill pill is a battle the right can win, because the grill pill is the red pill, just a very delayed red pill. By embracing the grill pill, Matt Kreisman has, at some level, given himself and his movement to what will in future years be certainly called the El Chapo Trap House to distant right pipeline. And after everything is said, and this process is completed, those conversions that eventually do happen will probably have very little to do with online blowhards like myself. Conversions, of course, are always organic. But before I sign off on this video, I will leave those listening with one final recommendation, at least one that I'm trying to adopt myself. In Catholic theology, there is a notion of the movement of the Holy Spirit. Contrary to what one might believe when watching missionaries at work, the general theological proposition is that the Holy Spirit inside the convert always moves before he has any external stimulus. Conversion is never externally imposed, it always emerges from within, driven by organic forces of truth, goodness, and beauty that are beyond human comprehension. God is always the first mover in the process of salvation. But even inside this general theory that takes the process of conversion and evangelization wholly out of human hands, we are still called to evangelize. We are still called to spread the faith. How does this occur? Well, without jumping too far down another rabbit hole, I probably could summarize briefly. It happens through organic action, through people sharing their deepest convictions with sincerity, through people being honest about their doubts and reservations, their hopes and fears, and also just through general compassion, community, friendship, and being there for people. Of course, in this time of lockdown and community quarantine, all of these actions seem very far from us. But I hope that once this ends and we return to whatever we now call normal, people take these lessons to heart. Sometimes the best you can do is to be there for people, to pursue the good earnestly and to speak with sincerity. Beyond ideology and what we think we can get preaching at people, there always is the very distinct possibility that we can accomplish much more, acting sincerely and delivering to everyone their very own grill pill.